class. Shit's real. They just have something going on, they won't come to class. Home quick week, right? That's a good day to be here. Because it's probability calculation day. Probabilities are fun. Did they do the practice problems that are posted in the lecture review? Nobody? No. If you fail on the quiz, then not my fault. You didn't try those practice problems. Seriously though, did anybody try the practice problems on the quiz lecture review?
Not yet.
Well then, why can't we can't have discussion? So you guys ruined the 5 minutes worth of lecture. By not doing any work.
I do have a question about the last problem on the practice, not the practice test, on the exam, question 4. It says look for blood type O, but there wasn't one listed, so I had a hard time with that.
O is recessive, so it's a little out of the line.
Okay.
It's something you were supposed to remember.
I thought so, but I was trying to remember.
A, AI, or capitalize, dominant will be assigned.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a quiz question, not a lecture review question. It wasn't nefarious, it's just it covered blood types. I assumed everybody would understand how to deal with blood types. Okay, then we'll go on and have this discussion about who's right and who's wrong. Sometimes it's a fun discussion. The main calculation we're going to try to do is to combine 2 different things together, which is to say Punnett squares and probabilities. Hello! Where are you going to sit? It's a new day. All right. So we're talking about Punnett squares and probabilities. Not just the probability of getting a certain child, but a certain number of children with a certain type of phenotype. And a lot of these are going to fall in the category we call repeated trial experiments, because the probabilities are not going to change because they're usually the same parents. Therefore, the probability of any particular phenotypic combination will be a constant. And when the probabilities are unchanged, we use what's called the binomial equation for calculating these probabilities. It's not a simple probability, but it's a more complex probability. And it's a complex probability because order does not matter when we do these experiments, when we do this calculation. If you want to look at order, then the calculation becomes very straightforward. But without order, there are multiple ways in which it can occur, so we need to account for all the different plausible sequences of events that give us the outcome that we desire. So keep that in mind, that this is the equation you use, not a simple probability calculation. It's a very simple statement to say this, but in practice, about a third of students try to calculate this probability by simply multiplying 2 things together and calling it good. And that's not what we can do. You can't just simply multiply 2 things together and call it the end. Now the basis of any type of binomial equation is to use the format of x plus y to some exponent. Did you guys do, we're gonna have math today? We're gonna have algebra. Who can solve x plus y squared? What's that? You, what?
You know, you boil it out.
Foil it?
First outside and inside.
I don't know what that foil word is. That's a new thing for me. Yes, you are correct. Whatever you're saying, that is right. I was just taught you're expanding the formula, or when you multiply these, it's a square thing, so you gotta do things together. So if you try to do x plus y squared, you get x plus y times x plus y. And you can do this math, which is pretty easy. Take x times x and get x squared. Take x plus y and get xy. Then you take y plus x and get yx. And plus y times y and get y squared. And if you put it all together, you get x squared plus 2xy plus y squared. Which is basic of any quadratic equation you probably haven't done in algebra at all. This is the simplest case. 2. We're going to do cases where there are 6 and 7. And so, as a fun experiment for you, how long will it take you to actually do x plus y to the 7th before you decide it's not worth it? Keep going. Once you do this experiment at home, see how long it takes you before you stop. Grading your answer, we'll calculate to see who has the most tolerance for bullshit. But that's basically what it is. I mean, math isn't bullshit, but doing x plus y to the 7th is kind of annoying. But in doing that expansion of a simple binomial equation, we get the numbers that we actually need to do the calculation. So instead of using x plus y, we use p plus q because why not? It's not that we don't use p and q for anything else. Let's use them here instead. Maybe this is where you got the expression, mind your p's and q's. Because we're going to have to pay attention to p and q when we do this type of equation. Now it's to the nth power, because n will represent an important number. And n is not the only number that we care about. There are lots of other numbers, or at least 2 other numbers. Or at least 5 other numbers. Not other numbers, but 5 total numbers. Yes, 5 total numbers we're going to deal with. 3 of them will be integers. 2 of them will be probabilities. If you keep that in mind, it should also help you as we go forward. Now you could sit here and do all these calculations, but I Googled it, and here's what Wikipedia says the answers are. If you wanted to do the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th or whatever, and you have to go down to the 8th. And people have already done this. There's a distribution set that you can actually look up. It tells you what is the first number going to be, what's the number for the first thing, what's the number for the second thing, and the third thing, and all these different things. It's a pyramidal approach for looking at these things. Now, if we were doing a simple probability, it would just be the x to the 4th or y to the 4th. We're doing some combination of both. And so we're going to do something that's more like this, where it's 10 times x squared times y to the cube. Or we're going to do this, 6x y fifth. It's all going to be very variable, depending on what the problem actually is. And so instead of simply memorizing these numbers or doing the whole binomial expansion, there's a simple formula that we can use to determine how many possible orders are there. And that's using this simple formula right here. I call it simple because I don't want you to get overly freaked out about all the different parts of it. But it's a really exciting problem. Why do I say that? It's got 3 exclamation points. It is super, super, super! Right? That's what those exclamation points mean. Just get really excited. I'm so excited. I have to do calculation, probability calculations. And some of you might already know what the exclamation point means other than exclamation. But we'll get to it in a second. If you don't know, it'll happen. But as you see here, we have P plus Q, we have S and T and N, and each of them are defined down here. N is the number of outcomes, so that's a pretty easy thing to look at. It's the total number of things that are possible. S and T are numbers of times that either P or Q occurs. P and S have to be linked together. Q and T also have to be linked together. But you get a choice on what you define P as, but S will follow once you define what P is. You have a choice. Well, don't have a choice anymore. Once you define P, Q is the other option. So, but what you choose as being P is a personal choice, which is why it's called P. It's a personal choice. I wasn't quite done with my joke yet.
It's not like a negative S and T, right? That's just like a dash, or are they negative?
It's not a negative. This is a PowerPoint thing where a dot is
Well, I was just
one
making
line
sure.
and the dash is the next line. So ended it in. Yes, it's not a negative S. Definitely really important thing. It's not a negative number. Because it's a number of events, we need to look at a positive number of events. And so what this value right here will give you, this will give us the number of possible orders of things. And this is our probability of the two things happening, and we just have to multiply all this stuff together. Now, a lot of times we are doing this anyways without even realizing anything. When you're only looking for one thing of P and one thing of Q, you can still use this equation and it'll work exactly the same because the first number would just be 1. Because 1 factorial divided by 1 factorial times 1 factorial is just 1. And so this equation can be used, could be used for every single thing that you do. Because all it is the multiplication rule. The probability of one event times the probability of another event. Just now we have multiples of number 1 and multiples of number 2 we have to deal with. And that's what changes everything. P to the power 1 is just P. Q to the power 1 will also just be Q. And so the probability equation that we just looked at with multiplication rule is no different than this. We're just looking at the behind the scenes aspect so we can add in something else to this equation. And so the question is, what is an example of a repeated trial? Flipping a coin is a good example of a repeated trial. Every time you flip the coin, the chance of getting heads and the chance of getting tails is exactly the same. It doesn't change from one flip of the coin to the other. And so in this simple model here, 1 heads versus 1 tails, because it says and instead of then, we have two options for how this can play out. Heads first or tails first. And so the probability of the first event, heads, then tails, is just 1/2 times 1/2, which is 1/4. The other possibility is also the same thing, 1/4, because tails times heads. And because there are two possibilities, we need to add those possibilities together to get this 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 1/2. These aren't things that you will actually see in your quiz for tomorrow, but will be things we'll see in our quiz for the next time. But we're going to again try to build up to getting to the very end. Now the other way that we could calculate this would be to use the equation. So when we look at this experiment, looking at 1 heads and 1 tails, how many total things are we looking to happen? So the total number of events that we need. What's it about? 2, right? 1 heads, 1 tails. 1 plus 1, 2. Won't make it any harder than it is. We're looking for one thing and another one thing. So that's 2 possible things. P and Q, we have the option of defining as one thing or the other thing. Do you want P to be heads or P to be tails? Who votes heads? Who votes tails? Tails win it. Just kidding, you can't win it because you did not get enough votes. So P is heads, and that means tails is Q, or Q is tails. And P is a probability. So it's not heads, it's the probability of getting heads. And this is not tails, but the probability of being tails. And this is where a lot of students will make a mistake. They will try to confuse S and P, or Q and T. We really want to make sure that when we're talking about P and Q, we always talk about them being a probability, which means it's either a fraction, or it's a decimal number, or it's a percentage. We keep those 3 things in mind when we think about probabilities. And because it has to be a fraction, a percentage, or a decimal number, it's not an integer. S and T are numbered events, therefore they are whole numbers. We can't ever get half of an event, or a third of an event. So when we think about P in probability, Q probability, so our probability is a half, because it's, and there's, each coin has 1 heads, and there's 2 possibilities when you flip the coin, heads or tails. So we're looking for 1 heads and 1 tails, so S and T are simply 1. And we plug it into our equation, we get 2 factorial times 1 factorial, divided by 1 factorial, times 1 factorial, 1/2 to the power of 1, and 1/2 to the power of 1. It's not on the slides yet, but I've been saying the word factorial for the exclamation point, and factorial means you take that number times every number until you get to 1. And so for 2 factorial, it's 2 times 1. If it were 3 factorial, it'd be 3 times 2 times 1. If it were 10 factorial, it'd be 10 times 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. You count all the digits in the middle. We'll get into more complex examples as we go forward. So 2 factorial is 2 times 1, so that's 2. 1 factorial is 1, and 1 factorial is 1. And 1/2 to the power of 1 is 1/2. It's not equals. That's multiplication. And 1/2 to the power of 1 is still 1/2. So if you put all these together, what do we get? We get 2 out of 4, which is 1/2. Same answer? Different way to work it. And the important thing about this is it just sort of sets the foundation of why this equation actually works. It's just simple math. But again, when we look at this, we can clearly see that we're combining both the addition rule and the multiplication rule together. The multiplication rule gives us the probability of the P and the Q, and the addition rule gives us the number of ways in which it can occur. So we really do both things when we do this equation. And so again, we haven't been doing it in practice, we've been doing it in principle, this type of idea. Let's see if we can do something a little bit more complex. Which is why this slide is labeled complex probabilities. Now it's not that bad. Here we're gonna play some D&D like we did on Friday. We've got a 6-sided dice and a 10-sided die. We're gonna roll each one, but we're gonna roll multiple die. We're gonna roll 3 of the 6-sided die and see if we can get 3 5s, and roll 4 of the 10-sided dice and see if we can get 4 8s. We need to define some things. We're gonna define N, determine what P is, so then we can get what S is, then get Q, so we can get G. Things we don't use with a plus sign. So this is a scenario where we're trying to get 3 of one thing and 4 of another. What is N? Right? This 7 is the total number of things, so there's 3 of one thing, 4 of another. Like always, you have a choice. What do you want the P to be? The 5 or the 8? Right, the 5 is on a 6-sided die. I've already told you the first part, which is the probability of getting a single 5 on one die is 1 out of 6, because again, that's 6 sides, so 5 is one of those 6. So 1 out of 6. And S would be 3. I was looking for 3 of that one thing to occur. Because we defined P, Q has to be the other thing. So the other thing is we need 4 of that one thing. And we need an 8 to come up 4 different times on a 10-sided die. There's a guy Y, our probability now would be 1 over 10. First question is, does anybody not understand how we arrive at these numbers? I'll take your silence for the fact that half of you do know what's going on, half of you don't know what's going on. Again, when we try to look at individual probabilities, we look at how many things do we want to happen, and how many total possibilities are there. Again, 1 out of 6, because the die only has 6 sides. Just like when you look at a deck of cards, there's 52 possibilities. You're looking for 1 out of 52, 4 out of 52, maybe 8 out of 52, who knows? Okay, how many things you want versus how many total things can happen. Now, if you just look at this, there are 7 different things we're looking for. And if you didn't have this equation, you would have to manually try to type out how many different ways can this event happen. And the probability you make a mistake here is probably pretty high, which is why the equation is really nice. Because the equation takes all the guesswork out. We simply just plug in the numbers, and then it's all to worry about. Did we get all the possibilities and account for all the possibilities? We just need to plug everything into our equation. So we have 7 factorial for s, sorry, t, and then s 3 factorial times t, which is 4 factorial. We take p, which is 1/6, that'll be to the 3rd power, and then we take 1/10 to the 4th. You don't need to do this part necessarily when you do this part. Because from this equation I can see if you've gotten all the 5 things correct already. But definitely make sure you start with one of these 2 things, so when it comes to the exam time that you want to try to get partial credit, I definitely need to know sort of where you started from. And if you don't show any work, then I don't know where you start from. But this is what we start from, and again, what the next slide is defining these things already. Although, for some reason, I didn't update that slide from last time, because that slide is crap. Look at this crap. Some of you might have noticed this, and told me this is a problem. I swear I fixed this last year. Apparently not, because I'm a dumbass. Right? Who agrees? Okay, you can call me a dumbass right now. It's liberating. Dr. Bridget, you're a dumbass. Come on, do it. Do it. Do it. Come on, say it.
Dr. Bridget, you're a dumbass.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Because I did this last year, and I fixed it. I barely only fixed it on that file. It hit save. So now it's saved. So next semester. No, there are 6s. That is something I didn't notice before.
Can I say it again?
No, you already said it once. You've lost your privileges.
It turns out.
Because if you say it again, you're bordering on being disrespectful. You don't want to be disrespectful. Now, somebody else could say it, but
Joe.
chances are now the moment has passed.
Shouldn't all the 10s be 8s then too?
Damn you! No, they were 6s and 8s because of. I'm not gonna say this. That's revert. I'll fix that one. Regardless of what it was, I'll fix it. The idea still is okay. The idea is still okay. Like, that's one thing. Anyways, it's fixed. Okay, good. Fixed. Somebody else can say it. It's okay. That's what happens when you just blindly copy things, but don't look at every single slide very closely. But now we have our equations. We simply need to do the math. And the next couple slides will work through the math for you. But just so we all have this in our notes written down, we will go ahead and do it by hand. 7 factorial. 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. You don't necessarily need to do that part, but it's sometimes helpful starting out. Make sure that you do everything correctly. Calculators have a factorial button on them, so it's really not an issue. Then we want to make our lives a little easier. We're going to break up our fractions into different parts. 1 to the power of 3 versus 6 to the power of 3. And 1 to the power of 4 versus 10 to the power of 4. Well, I've seen a lot of students get the wrong answer because of rounding errors. So that's why I do everything as integers before I even start eating my calculation, so I'm most likely to get to the right number. And sometimes I will want 4 digits here just to make sure rounding errors are not ever going to be an issue. We need to figure out what these numbers are, so if we just do the math, 7 factorial, we need to look ahead in our notes or do the calculation using our calculators. 5,040. That's what my notes say, and hopefully that's right. 5,040, or 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. 1 cubed is 1, and 1 to the 4th is 1. Makes it pretty easy to deal with. Also, by using whole numbers, if you try to take 1/6 to the power of 3, your calculator's going to round off at some point, and that might have an effect on the final answer. So I always do integers. So 3 times 2 is 6. 4. 12 times 2 is 24. 6 cubed is 6 times 6, that's 36. And then 36 times 6, anybody? 6 cubed? 6 cubed, anybody? You know how to look it up? That's what I got, right? 216. 216. And 10 to the 4th, that's pretty easy. That's just 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we see to solve. So we take 5,000 times 1, or 5,040 times 1 times 1, divide by 6, divide by 24, divide by 216, then divide by 10,000. And the answer that I have listed here is a really small number. Does anybody have an answer already?
I have 1.6204 times 10 to the negative 5.
04? You said 04?
1.6204.
2.
1.6204.
62. We don't need the 4 part. On mine, I have 16203. So again, that's sort of an error there. I'm not sure. Did you get 3 or 4 as final answer? And maybe that's a rounding problem. I don't know.
I got 3.
Okay. Which is why I'm gonna kind of ignore some things at the end. Just get, usually 3 is good enough to make sure you're doing it correctly. And if you have the right numbers here, the chance of getting the wrong answer are pretty small. So I can also double check to see if you get like, you know, +1 or whatever, plus or minus 1. And not a true 1, but whatever it is. I can see if you use the right numbers, and so chances are you'll get full credit on something like this. Now this is what you could write it as. You can also write it as a scientific notation if you want to. Which again would be 1.62 times 10 to the minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, minus 5. Or you can write it as a percentage. It's always fun to do. Really test your ability to use mathematics. You don't have to convert it to a percentage. But basically 2,000th of a percent probability of that thing occurring. But if you did 3 4s and 4 9s, what would the probability be?
Same.
It's the same, right? And that's the thing with probabilities. We're not looking at necessarily a unique event, because the probabilities don't change. The probability of the 6-sided die getting one number is the same for every other number. The probability of using a 10-sided die is the same for 8 as it is for 9, for 10, for 1. And so the probability of one thing happening is pretty small, but it's the same probability for all the other things as well. Sometimes one nice to think about. But we're not going to be rolling dice. We're going to be playing with genetics. Let's see if we can put this into practice. This one's not really a practice because the answers are cutting up a little bit, so we can walk through this. But here's an example of a word problem. This is not the type of word problem that you'll typically see with word problems is a very strange workload. I thought it was at least worthwhile to go over because it does require you to think a little bit about what the answer needs to be. So we have a mating experiment between two parents that are heterozygous. I said we want to, since we're dealing with complete dominance, because we have a 3-to-1 ratio, or it says complete dominance down there. And what makes this a weird problem is that we want 8 total children, and we want a 3-to-1 ratio of dominant to recessive. One of the things you have to sort of think about is, in a 3-to-1 ratio of 8 people, how many of those are actually going to be dominant, how many will actually be recessive? So you can think about that for a second. Or we can do P and Q first. Who wants to do N? Let's do N first. What's N? How many total children are we trying to get? 8. Hopefully N is the easiest number to get. The total number of events. 8 children. So we got one of the numbers already. We just need 4 other numbers. You want to do P and Q or S and T?
So P and Q.
I'm sorry, P and Q. The question tells you our parents are heterozygous. What does that mean for our genotype? Right, so we can simply use any letter we all use A. So because the question says that our parents are heterozygous, this is the type of information we need to start with. And so based off of this genotype, what phenotypes will we get in our offspring? And how many of each will show up? We can do the Punnett square. Or you can simply remember, what is this an example of? If we set up our Punnett squares, we follow the rule of segregation, separating the one allele from the other allele. Put one parent on the side, one parent on the top. And then we cross multiply, and this one will be dominant, this one will be dominant, this one will be dominant, this one will be recessive. So based on this genotype, 3 out of 4 dominants and 1 out of 4 recessives. So we want to define P as the dominant probability or the recessive probability? You're so predictable. If I had written it the other way, you would probably say that 1 over 4 is P. Because by default, we'll just say the first thing we read is the first thing we need to put down. So you may just go backwards by slide. But that's the first part of the problem, is calculating the probability of getting a dominant and the probability of getting a recessive. Does anybody have any questions about just simply using a Punnett square to determine how many dominants and recessives will show up? This is like one of the most important things about the equation that we're trying to build to is, can we simply look at a Punnett square and tell me how many will have one phenotype and how many will have a different phenotype? Alright, so we've done this part. Now we need to do the other part. Determine, when we have 8 total children, how many of those 8 will be dominant and how many of those 8 will be recessive if we want to maintain a 3-to-1 ratio. Does anybody know the equation we need to use to figure this out, or is it just logical? When you want a 3-to-1 ratio, how many total children are there?
8. We need 6 dominant and 2 recessive.
Yeah, you skip that. I was asking, when you have a 3-to-1 ratio, that's 4 children. And so simply by going from 4 to 8, we multiply everything by 2, which is what you did. But for everybody else, let's start to follow that logic. The other way to do it is to simply take 8 times 75% and 8 times 25%, because that's the probability of getting dominant versus recessive, and then calculating it that way. It doesn't really matter how you do it, but eventually you need to arrive at an answer of how many of one and how many of the other. So this one is 6, and I'll put 2 there. This is not the type of problem that you'll actually see on the exam. Because the question that you see in the exam is going to tie together multiple phenotypic appearances. But some of you, if you were working this, would make a mistake and have P and Q in opposite positions. Sorry, P and S. And you'll have Q and T mixed up. So as you're thinking about this and as you're studying this, make sure you always repeat the mantra or write down this idea. N, S, and T are all integers, whole numbers. P and Q are probabilities, which means they have to be a fraction or a decimal number. You keep repeating that same thing, hopefully you won't get these numbers mixed up in the wrong places. It's not half, but there are a fraction of students that will put 6 to the power of 3 over 4. That's something you want to sort of keep note of. If you're raising something to the power of a fraction, you've probably done something wrong somewhere. Because raising something to the power of a fraction is really weird in by itself. Don't just blindly put things there and hope for the best. Things should make sense where they go. So now that we have all of the numbers defined, we put them into our equation and we do the calculation. Which again, I break down all the numbers individually, all this case haven't done that quite that far. 8 factorial divided by 6 factorial times 2 factorial, 3/4 to the power of 6 and 1/4 to the power of 2. I'm not showing you what 8 factorial is, I don't have it written down. Does anyone know what 8 factorial is? It's okay if you don't want to worry about it. But 3 to the 6th and 4 to the 6th are there, and obviously 1 squared and 4 squared are pretty easy to do. But one of the things I really recommend you do to minimize your chance of mistake is just do all multiplication and do a pairwise or sequential deletion, or not deletion, do division. If you start dividing small numbers by big numbers, you get really small numbers very quickly. I deal with whole numbers whenever possible. And you gotta find your own way of doing this and figuring out how to get the right answer without any trouble. But the more work you show, the more chances you get for partial credit if you don't end up with the right answer at the end of the day. So if you feel confident, then you don't need to worry about all these little things we can do to make sure you're doing things in the proper order. And that one's worked out for you already. Well, let's see if we can do one without any input at all from the slides. This is the type of problem that you will see on the exam and then later this week on your next quiz. It's just to be a really mean person will be due on Sunday. Yeah, Sunday. That sounds like a good day, right? Right before you go away for fall break. Because we do, let's say 3 a.m. on Sunday. Yeah, that's a good time. That's good, right? Everybody's gonna be ready for that. I would recommend turning in your test before the Oklahoma, Texas game. Because after that game, I'm either really happy or very irritated.
Who's gonna win?
I don't know. If I knew, I could bet on it. Well, maybe make a lot of money. We need to define several things. Anything we can define starting out. Everybody should be able to define what n is. And how do we know it's 5? Well, if we read along, it says 2. And then it says 3. We're looking for 2 of one and 3 of another. Means we have a total of 5. I have a already made the decision for you what P and Q are, based on choosing what S and T are. But how do we figure out what P is and what Q is? We need some type of Punnett square to deal with. So we have heterozygous parents again. Two traits, eye color and hair color. Each trait is assumed to be controlled by a different gene. Therefore, we need to have two genes. Should we use random letters or letters that go with a phenotype or a trait? Random letters it is, which means parent 1 will be capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, and parent 2 will be exactly the same. That is what the problem tells us. Each parent is heterozygous. And because it's heterozygous, probabilities should be memorizable. So we're following Gregor Mendel's format of this is the F1 generation making the F2 generation in a dihybrid cross. We don't need to worry about dihybrid crosses because what can we do with the traits? We can separate them from each other. We can deal with A by itself, and we can deal with B by itself. And so if we do, we see this as the Punnett square for one gene, and we'll see the similar thing for the other gene. Here we get this 2 by 2. So we'll say that eye color is A, just for simplicity. We'll say that hair color is B. You could go the other direction, doesn't matter. But we need to be able to look at things in some way or another. Eye color is completely dominant, and we're looking for green eyes. So what is the probability of getting green eyes in this scenario?
3 in.
So I heard 75%, I heard something else, which is probably 3 out of 4. I always like to use fractions rather than decimal points. Because I like to take whole numbers to the powers of 3s and 4s rather than fractions or decimal points. Just writing down all those decimal points, more places to make mistakes. Whole numbers, less chances of making mistakes. But green eyes is 3 out of 4, which means blue eyes is 1 out of 4. It's a simple case of this one is green because it's dominant, this one is green because it's dominant, also green because it's dominant, and this one would be blue because it's the recessive, homozygous recessive. But it was completely dominant, which is why it worked out that way. The other one is incompletely dominant, something that you'll need to deal with eventually. At least one or more of the traits will be incompletely dominant, whereas most of them will be completely dominant. So now we need to think about blonde hair. So how many will, what was the probability of getting blonde hair? So it says black is completely dominant, or incompletely dominant with blonde with brown as intermediate. So if brown is intermediate, that means these two will be brown because they're the heterozygous cases. This one will be black because it's the dominant, and this one will be blonde because it's the recessive. So that's 1 out of 4 will be blonde. And we need brown hair, which is, what's the probability of getting brown hair? 2. So 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 2 out of 4, whatever. Like, it's 1/2 one. Now we're still not to the point where we define P and Q yet, because our children have to have 2 things: green eyes and blonde hair together, and then blue eyes and brown hair together. So green eyes is 3 out of 4, and blonde hair is 1 out of 4. So using the idea of the multiplication rule, combine green eyes and blonde hair together, which will give us what? 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 Yeah, figure out 16. Why don't we just multiply these together? Right, because that's what the multiplication rule says we do. And what's the probability of being cubed? The other trick with for blue eyes, brown hair. 1/4 over 1/4. No, it's 1/2. Round is 1/2. So that's 1/8. So who is stuck without having to get 3/4, 1/4, 1/4, and 1/2? Who didn't? Or doesn't understand how we use the Punnett squares over here to find the probabilities of each of the phenotypes. Okay. Okay, well, we have all the terms defined, which means we need to input them into our equation. And we'll see who gets the answer the quickest. Will it be me? I don't know. 5 factorial over 2 factorial times 3 factorial. 3 out of 16 squared times 1/8 to the third. 5 times 4 is 20. 20 times 3 is 60. 60 times 2 is 120. 2 factorial is 2. 3 factorial is 6. 2 squared is 9. 1 cubed is 1. 16 squared. Don't know that in my head. Let's use the calculator for more. 16 times 16. 8 times 8 times 8. 512. Am I gonna win? Am I gonna win? Or somebody else beat me?
I did.
What's the answer?
I got 6.87 times 10 to the -4th.
That's what you said, right?
Yes, sir.
Sir. So polite. So respectful. Young boy, sir. Now the question is, who is not even close? Who didn't even try it? Lame. Well, guess what you have on your lecture reviews for today? A whole bunch of practice problems.